how resilient is the financial sector to cybercrime? Is it well equipped to handle the threat? Or are cybercriminals becoming even more sophisticated than the firms they target? Crime is maybe the oldest risk finance has ever faced. The skills of financial criminals and the talents of those who thwart them have been pitted against each other since the days of the Renaissance. But today, the merger of cyber risk and financial crime has opened a whole new chapter in this story, and one that we're still just getting to understand. I'm Scott Martin from Deloitte Center for Regulatory Strategy, and you're listening to Regulated Radio. Our guest today is Sir Rob Wainwright, who's here to give us his views on the latest technology and security threats facing the financial sector. We'll be talking about what concerns regulators most about this risk, how firms can position themselves to survive in such a dangerous landscape, and what lessons we can learn from cyber attacks that have actually succeeded. So all this coming up in the next 20 minutes or less. This is a threat whose complexity and urgency is growing fast, and this is Regulated Radio. Nearly 2 decades into the 21st century, cybercrime is a threat that no firm can still afford to ignore. The rapid adoption of digital technologies is moving hand in hand with an increase in the frequency and visibility of cyber attacks. In 2018, 61% of European firms reported a cyber attack that resulted in financial losses. That's up from just 45% the year before. Firms in the financial sector, of course, are a special kind of target because of their size, interconnectivity, and the critical role that they play in everyone's lives. Financial regulators across Europe have been clear that how firms deal with cyber risks is now among their very top priorities. So for this show, I'm really pleased to be joined by Sir Rob Wainwright to get his thoughts on these fascinating issues. Sir Rob is a senior partner in Deloitte's European cyber and financial crime practices. He has a long background in security, and before joining Deloitte, spent 9 years as the executive director of Europol, the European law enforcement agency. In 2018, he was knighted by Her Majesty the Queen for his services to policing and security. Sir Rob, it's great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you, Scott.
So you've spent a lot of time looking at the kind of new and emerging threats in the financial sector today. And this is, of course, a sector that's rapidly going digital, which brings with it a whole new series of challenges that we still don't fully understand. I'm wondering what, in your view, are some of the most concerning security threats that you think firms and regulators need to start taking seriously today?
One of the things I've been most concerned about, doing my law enforcement career now, working across many industries, is the rising scale. The sheer number of attacks. You mentioned an increase in your opening remarks that we're seeing. In fact, some of the cybercrime attacks that we're seeing are being generated in ways just reutilizing old cybercrime capabilities. They're not particularly new. But what's driving the cyber criminal economy at scale is the way in which those old tools are being used time and again to get through our back doors to steal data. So the illegal acquisition, exploitation of personal data is what's driving the economy. The dumping of large amounts of personal data on dark marketplaces, for example, so that fraudsters can use it for other purposes. At the same time, we're seeing the evolution of a global infrastructure of the criminal economy itself, using those dark marketplaces, many other means by which to interconnect on a global scale. So the sheer power and interconnectedness of the cyber criminal economy is much larger than we've ever seen it before. And as it swings, therefore, as a machine to exploit our own digital ecosystem, I think we're seeing more and more challenge coming from cybercrime.
So among the threats that you have observed, is there one that you think is changing rapidly?
Yeah, at the same time as where I'm seeing, maybe 80% of the cyber criminal economy are, utilizing old tools. At the top end, in the last 2 years, there's definitely been an emergence of a more aggressive, more enterprising line of attack by serious cyber criminal actors and malicious state actors that are using very advanced form of social engineering and malware, for example, now to directly target bank transfer payment systems, the internal networks of telecommunication companies or pharma companies and so on. So a shift at the top end of this economy to much more dangerous threats, and that concerns me as well.
That's really interesting because the last time we discussed cyber risk on Regulated Radio, our guest then noted that there's this gap between capabilities and intent when it comes to threats. Now, that's to say that the kind of state actors that have very advanced cyber capabilities don't really have the intent to do real damage to the financial system because, of course, they're a part of it. Thinking about those who do have the intent, how sophisticated would you say the capabilities of really top-end cybercriminals are today, and how quickly are they improving?
The criminal gang that I remember working on at Europol in the recent years, and they're still active today, that had the biggest adverse impact on the financial services community was the so-called Carbonite gang. They stole $1.2 billion from 100 financial institutions through this combination of malware, social engineering. What I saw about that, a very important strategic shift, was that this one criminal syndicate was utilizing cyber means, fraud means, and also money laundering as part of one big integrated play. And that's important because in the banking sector, we're still compartmentalizing how we manage those different risks. And that's wrong because we're not seeing the join in the criminal economy that's hitting us. So I think there is a more sophisticated utilization now of capability. At the same time, what is exceptionally dangerous is the warning sign we had a couple of years ago from the NotPetya attack, which was attributed to a malicious state actor regime, an attack on the Ukrainian government infrastructure, not aimed at all at any commercial companies, and yet a number of global companies hit very, very much, had their global IT networks wiped in a matter of minutes, and they were not even the intended target of that attack. Now, that says something about the collateral damages that is out there from operating in an interconnected digital ecosystem. There's great dangers that lay there, even when we're not the intended target, and we have to move, therefore, to a different form of cyber defense as a result.
Right. Now, one really hot topic in financial regulation that I'd like to get your views on is what regulators and supervisors should do about cryptocurrencies. How would you say the rise of cryptocurrencies or other digital assets has changed the security outlook for the financial system?
Well, there are many potential benefits, of course, that are being realized right now, and it's an example of how technology can bring great benefits to our private and business lives. At the same time, as a law enforcement professional, I've also seen the flip side. I've seen how criminals have exploited cryptocurrencies. It's the primary reason why ransomware has become a dominant malware threat today. Criminals have always been in the business of extorting money from businessmen, for example. Meet me under the bridge at midnight, give me $10,000, don't tell the cops. And the criminal didn't know if the cops would actually be there waiting to arrest him. They can do all of that now in a perfectly anonymized way online by using cryptocurrency. They don't have to expose themselves to any physical risk of being arrested. And that in itself has been a huge stimulus to why ransomware now has become such a primary threat. I've also seen how cryptocurrencies are used for money laundering, for example. So in that sense, I welcome the moves that we're seeing now in the regulated sector to try and bring cryptocurrencies perhaps back more into line with the regular financial instruments.
So when you speak to clients, what would you say are the most urgent things that leaders in the financial sector can do to help defend their organizations and make their firms more resilient to these kind of risks crystallizing?
I think it is that mindset of resilience, about us recognizing, which hasn't always been the case, that you can't remove the threat. There is no silver bullet out there. There is no magic dollar you can spend on the very latest bit of technology. You can't throw money at this. It's still not going to remove the threat. When we're faced with the impact of a potentially catastrophic loss, when you're not even the intended target, you have to therefore move to a position of insulating yourself as much from this environmental risk as possible. That's therefore taking some reasonable measures according to the risk profile that you're comfortable with, according to what business you need to undertake. What is really important is that companies make a more determined effort to really understand the nature of the threat against them, to understand which vulnerabilities they're trying to protect. What are the core assets in their IT systems especially that they really must protect at all costs? And then you can have a more focused, a more targeted protection regime around that. And then you're in the business of just monitoring day-to-day your systems and recovering from a potential incident as soon as possible. So I always say to boards that I'm speaking to, get it into your head that this is about resilience now, not removing the threat, and just adopt a risk management strategy in the same way as you do in managing many other risks. In a way, there's nothing exceptionally magic about cyber. It's just another risk, albeit an important one that you've got to manage. You've got the tools and experience for doing it in other areas. Do it in this case as well.
So you mentioned leveraging technology. What are the smartest ways for firms to be able to do this?
I think it's going to what I said earlier about what we're seeing emerging in the criminal market, about the growing convergence of crime. fraudsters, cyber criminals, money launderers are starting to work in tandem, sometimes as part of the same syndicate. And yet, because the banks are so separate in the way that they manage to do that, they have to try and bring their data streams together, for example. So my experience at Europol is that when we brought over 1,000 law enforcement agencies together on a single intelligence sharing platform, the insights we got from that were profound in terms of our really seeing the full extent of what is now a converged criminal economy across Europe. Now, we did that at large scale and absolutely powered us in a different way. And my strong message to all banks currently is think about how you can do that in this space. So your cyber data, your fraud data, your money laundering data on a single platform. Create an intelligence brain at the heart of the way in which you manage risk. And that would power a whole different way in which you can manage cybercrime and the many other factors as well.
But one problem that the industry often runs into with this kind of change is just the cost of it all, especially with the compressed margins that many firms, particularly European banks, have been facing for years. How do you think that the executives responsible for driving this kind of preparation should make the case to their boards that responding to this kind of risk needs to be taken seriously enough now to get scarce funding?
I think it's difficult because I think a lot in what we see in the cybersecurity community is a lot of selling by fear. And that's unfortunate because it leads to more defensive mindsets. At the same time, I think executives have got to make the case for a responsible level of funding. What's at stake here is that you can have your IT systems crippled, you can go out of business, and that's going to affect your bottom line as well. So a responsible level of funding, according to the risk profile that you've said, that's important. At the same time, look for the benefits, the synergies that are on offer of using technology, for example, to automatize a lot of your cybersecurity protection measures, about integrating the way in which you can manage other threats like money laundering and fraud as well. I think there are tremendous benefits in using technology to drive down costs and optimize the way in which you protect yourselves.
That's really interesting, but how do you get that message out there to industry?
Well, I'm fortunate in my position as a partner of Deloitte to have access to many of the boardrooms, executive teams of some of the biggest banks in the world. So I spend a lot of time working with them, in private to give them that advice. But I also, find it very useful to speak at major events. I'm very happy to be in London here this week to attend Cybos, which, as some of your listeners might know, is the world's premier financial services event. First time it's being held in London. It's great to see it here. And that's a major avenue, major platform to get this message out. And I will be, conveying that message to make sure that I can help to inform industry and move it to a better place in the future.
Now, there's certainly a lot for firms to do, but thinking about the public sector side, is there something that you think regulators could be doing better in order to help the sector be more ready for cyber-enabled financial crime?
It's certainly a much less well-regulated area than it is, for example, in the case of money laundering. That said, I have my concerns that we've gone too far, over-regulated financial crime, and it's led to a compliance tick box culture. So I don't think we necessarily need to go that far. But where there have been sensible steps, for example, to encourage threat-based strategies, for example, to make sure you identify the right vulnerabilities. Bank of England have done some work in this area. There's an initiative across the EU, which is around pinpointing and stress testing every bank and pinpointing where it needs to shore up the defenses. I think that's a responsible thing to do. I think also one point that's important, I think, is regulators should try to encourage to open up the pathways of information sharing between banks. And even across jurisdictions as well in this area, because it's clear to me from my experience at Europol, the more you combine points of data, the more you can see the bigger picture and the better informed you can be therefore about the threat that's facing you.
But is that something where you think banks can really overcome the competitive concerns of sharing information, sharing data with their competitors?
I think they should. I mean, it's easy for me to say, of course, because we're in an area where normally competitive rules apply. This is, in my view, clearly one of those areas where it's a non-competitive space, that is the industry as a whole that's undermined here. And I think, therefore, we need leaders in the industry, leaders of the largest companies in those sectors, to stand up and be counted, show some leadership and say, I'm going to put my data, I'm going to share it in a common way with others for the good of the industry. And that's the kind of leadership I think sometimes customers like to see, regulators like to see, governments like to see, for the good of the industry. And I think banks can afford to do that without taking any undue risks in this area.
So, keeping our public policy hats on, one challenge we face in almost every field of regulation is poor cross-border regulatory coordination, and, of course, the costs and vulnerabilities that this can create for firms that operate on a cross-border basis. Now, you've headed an international organization, so I'm very interested in your view here. As the regulatory framework around cyber risk emerges, do you think that cross-border cooperation between regulators on cyber issues will be stronger or weaker than in other areas of financial policy?
I think it's getting better, but it's not good enough. Certainly when I worked, serving a community of over 40 countries in the law enforcement space in Europe, we saw just how many opportunities the criminals were utilizing in moving cross-border, for example, moving themselves and their illicit commodities. We had to play catch-up and therefore use the mechanisms available to us in the EU space to build systems that allowed for police-to-police cooperation across countries in a more seamless way. And, we went a fair way down that track and had some success. I think we need to replicate that kind of model in the banking sector, for money laundering, by the way, as well as to combat cybercrime. And, there we need to manage sometimes the contradictory interests of data privacy, banking secrecy, for example. And that's tough as well. But at the moment, I don't think we've got the balance quite right. So I think this is something that still we need to work on, to have generally more collaborative international response to what is clearly an international problem of cybercrime.
Now, Rob, we always end every episode of Regulated Radio by asking our guests to predict a major development or trend in their area. I'm trying to think about what our listeners would most like to hear from you before you go, and I keep thinking of that infamous Donald Rumsfeld quote about unknown unknowns, big vulnerabilities that exist but that we just don't know about until they're exploited. So I'm really interested to know, what do you think is the most underrated security risk today that the financial sector will have to care a great deal about in 5 or 10 years' time?
I think the darkest shade of the threat picture that's emerged in the last couple of years is the growing footprint of malicious state actors. We've gone from a trajectory where, the threat vector in that case was fairly narrow. It was always aimed at government, military institutions. Now it's much wider. Now there are corporate concerns that are directly targeted. And here, we're facing with the most advanced offensive forms of cybercrime. So they do a lot of damage, and we've seen some examples of that. They're in the business of making money, stealing our commercial secrets. IP theft is a huge problem in this sector and many others, as well as, very advanced forms of destructive malware. What I'm concerned about is the further evolution of that. That capability and the intent that might come with it might really cause a lot of systemic harm to our economy. We might see the emergence of targeted insider risk, for example. I don't think that's likely in the short term, but, the planting of those that are working for other malicious state actors in some of our financial institutions, that would be seriously challenging, I think, for us to deal with. And I think we need to be alive to at least the possibility of that.
That is very concerning, and certainly, I imagine, will be a really big challenge for the sector going forward. Sir Rob, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, thank you.
And there you have it. Enough for us to keep regulators up at night, or more likely, to get them to push the financial sector into taking its preparedness for cybercrime to the next level. This will no doubt be a major regulatory challenge, but also undoubtedly a huge commercial opportunity if firms can make it through their digital transition in a much more secure and resilient way. Now remember, if you like the show, hit the subscribe button to ensure you receive notifications about new episodes. And if you're already subscribed, you can give us a review on your platform of choice or email us with your thoughts at regulatedradio@deloitte.co.uk. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget, if you listen to Regulated Radio and think, this is great, then do us a big favor and recommend the show to a friend or a colleague. You know they'll want to join the podcast revolution. But that's all for now. Thanks so much for joining us, and you'll hear from us again soon.